Well, it's about time I talked about this one. So, for day 8, we're going to be taking a look at Genocyber. Now, yes, I know in the past I've always used to call it Genocyber, and I still do, mainly because it just seems to just stick out more to me. I don't know why. It's just one of those weird shit things I can't explain, but whatever. So yeah, this is one of those animes that I have watched once before, but I wanted to watch it again just so I get a fresh take on it. And I always mentioned it a lot in my reviews, mostly being last year, or whenever I talked about an anime that was like super fucking violent, I'd always say, well, it's not as violent as Genocyber. Because for those that don't know, this is one of the most violent animes I've ever seen in my life, and I still do think so to this day, so that hasn't changed at all, I can tell you that. So knowing that, I'll flat out and say this, that if you do not like violence whatsoever, then just turn off this video and move on to something else. But one thing that is interesting though, is that this anime was indeed based after a manga, but the manga was cancelled. So pretty much this little OVA series of 5 episodes actually lasts longer than the manga it was based on. And I have heard from those that have read the manga said that it is pretty different even compared to its first episode. But I haven't read it myself, so I can't confirm that for sure, but that's just what I've heard. So anyways, without further ado, let's talk about the story in this fucked up one. So it begins with the Kuryu group is working on a new project, and that being the Genocyber project, which is a biological weapon. So the main characters in this one are two twins named Elaine and Diana, who both have psychic powers but also do have some downsides to them, where Elaine is mute and cannot speak, while Diana cannot move unless she is in a mech suit. So these two characters are being treated as experiments for the Genocyber project. So while Elena is out and about, she ends up befriending this little kid character named Davy, who is actually being bullied by a bunch of shitheads. But while all this is happening, there is a group of cyborgs that are chasing after her, and Diana is under strict orders to return Elaine back. So eventually Diana and Elaine fight each other, and once she sees the cyborgs having Davy within a hostage situation, she ends up getting really pissed off and ends up fusing with Diana to create Genocyber, and this is where shit gets real. Even though there was a lot of death and carnage before, but now it's gonna happen on a grand scale. So after Genocyber awakens, the two cyborg characters end up transforming into a really weird monstrosity. And, you know, they fight, and eventually Hong Kong gets totally annihilated. So that pretty much sums up the first episode, and as for episode 2 and 3 have their own little arc. So these two episodes take place on a carrier ship, and there is a doctor character named Myra who ends up looking after Elaine. And obviously she is not within the Genocyber form, and she looks after her like she is her own kid. And there is a machine being created on the ship called the Vadronoid, and it's secretly being used for evil purposes. So that sums up that whole saga, but there is one thing I really should mention because it just shows you how much this anime just gives no fucks whatsoever. And that is the way how episode 2 starts out. It probably has one of the most offensive openings ever. So what happens here is that you see a helicopter shooting at a bunch of kids, and you actually see every single detail here. It doesn't like cut away from it, or it doesn't happen off screen, you actually see everything. It's pretty fucked up. So like I said, this anime is not for the sensitive type. And the last 2 episodes also have their own little arc to them, and this is where shit gets pretty weird. So many years have passed, and now everything is in a post-apocalyptic world, and there is a huge city called Grand Arc, which kinda reminds me of Metropolis in many ways. So the higher-ups on the city are a bunch of assholes, while all the bottom feeders at the bottom are just trying to do the best they can to survive and are treated like shit. And there are 2 characters that move into the city, being Ryu and Mel. So Ryu is a professional street fighter. Nah, I'm just kidding. He's actually throws knives for a knife throwing act. And Mel happens to be blind, so Ryu wants to raise as much money as possible with his knife throwing act so then he can pay for her surgery, which can only be done in the higher ups. Now, for anyone that's listening to this and you haven't watched this anime yet, and you're probably thinking, what the fuck does this shit have to do with the biological weapon Genocyber? Well, Genocyber is still around, but it's in sleep mode at the moment, and it's ready to be awakened at any given time. And the only people that seem to acknowledge its existence happens to be this religious group that lives underground. So that's that. But yes, overall, Genocyber is basically about a science experiment gone completely wrong. So now, let's get talking about the show's animation. And the quality of this one is kind of all over the place, but I'd say it is mostly very good. So the first 3 episodes, the animation is pretty great, but as for episode 4 and 5 though, yeah, it definitely takes a downturn. But yeah, not only does it have really good animation, and also does have some really cool aesthetics. I especially really love Genocyber's look. In fact, he kind of looks like a mixture between Devilman and Bao the Visitor, which is pretty awesome. But the showstopper here for animation has to be the blood and the gore, which you cannot ignore when you talk about this anime. Yeah, like I said earlier, this is one of the most violent animes I've ever seen in my life. I'd even say it's more violent than Midori. But the one good thing I can say is that at least this doesn't have a dog death scene in it, but it still does have its fair share of controversies, like I said, about the kids dying, and also it does have a rape scene early on in the first episode. But yeah, the blood and the gore in this one is just absolutely batshit insane. Not only does it have an excessive amount of blood, and it's also very over the top, but it's also like really crazy detailed. So whenever you see someone's brain matter and intestines and shit, not only is it heavily detailed, but also the way how it animates too, it's quite shocking. And like I said many times, I still have yet to see an anime that has even outdone something like this. The only one that came close would be, like I said, Midori, there's Angel Cop, and then there's Violent Jack. And in a realistic sense, there is also Barefoot Gen. And speaking of realistic, there's actually one death scene that really stands out to me just because it is just so fucking odd. So there is one death scene where a dude is imagining a bunch of bugs in his head and he ends up cutting up his own head, which is pretty nasty, but the thing is though, it then cuts away to a live action shot of a bug eating out of a head and you actually see brain matter coming out. And obviously it's not an actual snuff film of something that really happened, instead it's actually being used with old practical effects that kinda remind me something out of a John Carpenter film, The Thing. Yeah, by the way this sounds, it sounds very tacky, which it kinda is, but at the same time though, I just thought the effect was just really interesting and kinda unique and cool, so I actually kinda liked it. Now, as great as all this sounds, unfortunately, the last 2 episodes, the animation is not nearly as good. Not only does it look choppier, but also there's not nearly as much blood and guts happening within it, and whenever there is, it's definitely not as detailed as what it was in the first 3 episodes. So it's kind of a shame that it ends off like that, but otherwise though, I would mostly say that the animation in this one is not only impressive, but it's just really freaking good. So now, as for the show's music, the music in this one is just amazing. I fucking love it. And even after not seeing it for many years, I still remembered it very well. So it has these really cool sounding techno songs, which are very fitting to the settings, and you got some intense creepy stuff, which actually fits perfectly with the scenes. But as much as I love all this though, I have to say the ending theme on this one is just fantastic. It's a heavy metal song with a female lead called Fairy Dreaming, and man, I just fucking love it. It has like a lot of fast shredding and everything. And I would go as far to say that it is probably one of my favorite ending themes of all times. It really is that damn good. But as for the other ending theme that does play though, that one's also pretty damn good too, but it's more softer sounding, but it's still great. So overall, I find that the music in this one does not disappoint. It still holds up awesomely. So now, as for the show's voice acting, well, you probably could take a guess how this one's gonna turn out. I mean, I don't really need to say much, but yeah, it's bad. But one thing I can say is that it was actually kind of funny bad sometimes. Also, there was a couple lines that actually were delivered okay, but it's just too inconsistent though. And one thing that does make this one to be a bit more amusing is that it tries to be the whole, like, hardcore and edgy. So yeah, not only does this anime give no fucks, but there's also a lot of fucks in it. And also literally too, because in episode 4, Ryu and Mel end up getting laid. So it definitely defies the word fuck. And another thing that I also found to be amusing with this dub is that there is actually 2 members within the cast that I actually do recognize. But I recognize them in things that I never expected I would. So firstly, there's Stuart Milligan, who happens to play in the live-action movie Sky Captain in the World of Tomorrow, which is a badass movie. Yeah, I never would have expected an actor from that movie would play in such an edgy anime like this. And another huge surprise was William Roberts is in here, and in case you don't know who he is, he actually played in The Witcher 3. Yeah, he played Vesemir, the one that happened to be the oldest Witcher who taught Geralt a lot of stuff. Yeah, pretty fucking cool. So that's just some little known facts about that, but yeah, unfortunately the dub is just not very good in this one. Not the worst that I ever heard, and certainly not the worst within this feature, but still not good. So now, as for my overall thoughts on Genocyber, is that, well, before I tell you what I currently think, I'll tell you first what I originally thought when I saw this one many years ago. So the first time I saw it, outside of the blood and the gore and the awesome music, unfortunately, I actually thought it was pretty boring and forgettable. Yeah, having the most violent anime ever come off as boring, yeah, that's pretty bad. But yes, that was my original thoughts, but now after watching it all these years later, with a fresh open mind, well, believe it or not, my opinion has changed. I do kinda like it, and it actually did grow on me. But with that said though, I wouldn't call it great though. I would at least say that it was decent. So while my opinion may have changed for the better, I still wouldn't say it's a great anime. But I did like it for what it was. So while the story starts out to be pretty easy and basic to understand, I thought it was at the very least entertaining. And not only just for the over-the-top violence, but also I found that there were some interactions that were pretty interesting. Like with the main character Elena, yeah, she cannot speak, but yet her emotions really does says quite a bit. Especially after seeing that one scene where she sees her friends getting shot at by a helicopter being piloted by a bunch of asscocks. And thankfully, you get to see those asscocks get shit on pretty hard, so it was quite satisfying. But other than the main character Elena though, I find that a lot of the other characters were not really the most in-depth ever, and that's fine by me, but I also did like the character Dr. Myra. I thought she was also pretty interesting as well with the way how she overlooked Elena. So there is a couple things about the characterization that I do like for what it is. It's not overly amazing, but it was good for this type of anime. But as for the last two episodes, however, though, yeah, this is where the anime really starts to fall apart, and I can see why people would hate it after watching these last two episodes. Now, the two main characters at these parts, they're not terrible characters, but I just found there was really nothing much that really made me want to, really like them much. And by the way, with the whole concept of, having, the Metropolis world and, a post-apocalyptic world, I have to say, I actually thought it was kind of an interesting idea, and it could have actually been good, but unfortunately, it just wasn't handled very well. Not only is it a lot more boring and slow and doesn't really seem like it has much to do with the original story, but it can also be a little bit on the incoherent side for that. Even after watching this one for the second time, I still don't really know how the fuck some shit happens. Also, the ending I just didn't think was that satisfying, despite the fact that Genocyber eventually wakes up and breaks shit. It just wasn't as entertaining as it was in the first episode. Also probably doesn't help with the fact that the animation is significantly much worse. And I feel like if they would have cut these last two episodes out and just made Genocyber into just a 3-episode series and maybe use these last two episodes for, I don't know, some other thing of its own or something, then you know what, I think it would have been worked out a lot better. So here's the thing I have to say, is that Genocyber, the first 3 episodes, I do like them for what they are. I thought they were actually pretty entertaining. I liked them a lot better than I did the first time I watched it. But the last 2 episodes, yeah, they're still just as crappy as I remember them. So if you did want to check this one out, if you are interested, then I would say watch the first 3 episodes, and if you like it, then maybe if you're curious, you can watch those last 2, but honestly, it's not really worth it. And speaking of recommendations, yeah, this is not an easy anime I could recommend to people. And the reasons are pretty obvious, I don't need to re-explain it. But pretty much, if you want to look for a super ultra violent anime, well, this is it. And like I said, for me personally, I have yet to see something that even tops it. And as I said before with the ones I mentioned, I've seen a lot of shit, so that really says a lot. But I'd say that the nightmare fuel on this one is pretty medium for me personally, but I can totally understand why some people would rank it pretty high on the nightmare fuel though. So to sum it up, if you like to see a lot of blood and gore, then watch this shit. If you don't, well, just avoid it at all costs. But if you want to watch it for its story, though, I would say that it's decent. It's not overly amazing or great, and it definitely is very flawed, especially the last 2 episodes, like I mentioned before. But I'd say that I do like the story for what it is. It was at least consistent with its tone. So that's all I gotta say about Genocyber. I was actually quite surprised that I ended up liking it more than I remembered it being, but shit happens sometimes. And next time, yep, I'm gonna be revisiting another one that I once watched before, being Violent Jack, so yeah, that should be interesting.